Good afternoon. I'm Rochelle Pinder-Cuffey, Director of Student and Community Affairs at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, SLU. Thank you all for joining us today for this important discussion about the role of artists in justice movements, a conversation on health and disability justice in collaboration with Visual AIDS and the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium. I'm thrilled to welcome you virtually to SLU and to the second event in the series of LGBTQIA+ programming that SLU will host in the 2023-2024 academic year in partnership with the consortium. The CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium is an important initiative that centers the voices of the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as facilitates the archiving of LGBTQIA+ history across New York City, and LGBTQIA+ training, education, and programming at CUNY colleges. Thank you again for participating in today's discussion. I now welcome Sarah Watson, Director of the Murphy Institute at SLU, to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Rochelle. I'm Sarah Watson, Director of the Murphy Institute here at SLU, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have Pato Herbert and Ali A. Muhammad here with me on Zoom to discuss the role of artists in justice movements. And before we start our conversation, I want to thank my colleagues in the public engagement team who have made this event happen, Michael, Nadia, and Rose. I also want to thank my colleagues in student and community affairs, Rochelle and Kevin, for partnering with the Murphy Institute on the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium programming this year. This program is organized in connection with Visual AIDS Day Without Art, Everyone I Know Is Sick. And thank you to Kyle and Elena at Visual AIDS for your partnership. And I want to thank our ASL interpreters, Elizabeth and Steve. And just as a note, following the conversation, there will be an opportunity for audience Q&A, and we'll close today's program with a poem by Ali A. Muhammad. So please make sure to stay around until the end of the program. On Friday, December 1st, SLU participated in Day Without Art in partnership with Visual AIDS by screening the film series Everyone I Know Is Sick, which generates connections between HIV and other forms of illness and disability. And it invites us to understand disability as a common experience rather than an exception to the norm. And it's in this spirit that we join together for the conversation today with Pato and Ali. I'll do some brief bios for both Pato and Ali, and I believe they will also be put in the chat, and then we'll get into the conversation. Pato Hebert is an artist, teacher, and organizer. He has worked in HIV prevention initiatives with queer communities of color since 1994. He has curated exhibitions and led creative initiatives at the International AIDS conferences on multiple occasions. He is a COVID-19 long hauler, living with the impacts of the coronavirus and publicly addressing the pandemic since March of 2020. Ali A. Muhammad is a Philadelphia-born and raised queer Black Muslim writer. In their work, they often problematize medical surveillance, discuss the importance of body autonomy, and center Blackness. Ali is the creator of Black Reverence Chair, a joy and affirmation ritual. They are co-convener of Finding Ceremony, a descendant community-controlled process, restoring the lineage of care, reverence, and spiritual memory to the work of caring for our dead. Thank you both for joining us here. To get things started, I wanted to open the conversation with an opportunity for both of you to share a little bit about your entry into organizing and activism and the arts, starting the conversation really with the idea that we can bring here today our multiple selves, the artists, the organizers, kind of as our whole being. So I wanted to kind of kick things off with that opportunity and invitation to both of you to share.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for having Pato and I in conversation. I'm so excited to be here. I began, I guess, organizing in high school. When I was in high school, the US had just entered Afghanistan and began war there. And then shortly after that, the Iraq War began, and I started doing anti-war organizing work my senior year of high school, and saw that it was, a very horrible situation happening, and that I needed to do something as a U.S. citizen and as a Muslim to ensure that people knew that there was resistance to the policy of invasion. And in terms of my artistic work, I've been a writer since I could write. When I was a kid, I would write in composition books, the marble composition books, often short stories that were fantasy stories about witches, about magical beings. And then I believe it was middle school, I forget often if it was middle or elementary school, but I believe it was middle school. A teacher of mine, a social studies teacher, read an essay that I had written, and then asked if I wanted to enter a poetry contest. And then I learned that I had a poetic voice and began writing poetry then. And since then, I've kind of been exploring more of my artistic side with collaborative photography projects, poetry chapbooks, and collaboration with amazing artists like Pato, and durational performances that was led by Julie Tolentino and other amazing artists. And so I'm trying to lean in more to that artistic self.
Yeah, I'm always tempted to say, I feel like you were writing before you were writing. You were certainly poeting, and and I love how multifaceted your creativity and artistry and politics are. And similarly, I mean, at a time in my late teens when I was feeling like that artists were those people over there, what I sometimes call capital A art, and that it was a certain kind of person with a certain kind of talent or class standing that could make art. In some ways that reveals my own naivete, but in other ways it reveals like art's relationship to power. And at the same time that I was beginning to ask myself a question of like, I like this drawing thing. I like making pictures. I like getting my hands dirty and making stuff. Could I make something of that? Could I make a way in the world? I was really responding to the immediacy that art gave to me, and a way to be present with myself and others. You mentioned collaboration, Ali. And at the exact same time that I was going through these questions about how might I stay connected to and honor and embody my own creative energy and do that with others, politics around me and in the world were literally exploding. So on December 20th, 1989, the US invaded Panama in an extraordinarily violent and intense regime change. And so we're approaching the 35th anniversary of that, which will happen a week from today, next week. And my mother's Panamanian, my father's white, and I am born of this imperial encounter. And so seeing that invasion on the news, and eventually once we could get through, back before we had cell phones and landlines were very hard to sometimes connect across borders and time and space. We hear the stories of my, my abuelitas, my grandmother's horror at hearing the planes screaming overhead. So of course I'm thinking about that moment 34 years ago in what we've been seeing over the last 2 months right now. And these were really painful early lessons in the violence enacted by empire, and questions of power. And so I began to ask, like, what might the role of artists be? Like, how would we show up inside these processes? And that doesn't mean we're always an artist, but it also doesn't mean that art's always left to the side. And so just thinking through that dialectic, that relationship, was something that I started doing in my late teens. And then I was given a flyer by a roommate, and she said, "Oh, I think you should go to this." And it was a flyer for a creative writing reading at the old Modern Times bookstore in San Francisco's Old Mission District. And so I went, and it was this incredible reading by beautiful brown, Latinx, queer and bisexual men, mostly cis men. And I had never been in a space where I had heard people, especially men, speaking with such kind of courage and vulnerability and tenderness and irreverence, let alone queer brown men like that. And it was really transformative to see what creative writing and storytelling, poetry, a sense of poetics could do to make a space together right there, right then, but holding all these stories and lineages and possibilities. And there are more steps to the story, but that really eventually became my entree into doing HIV work, mostly with queer Latinx communities and communities of color more broadly. And that really shaped my sense of the role of creativity inside of how we take care of each other and how we change the world, particularly in the face of governments and capital and other forces that could care less, just want to kind of consume and extract. And what it meant through art to not just consume and extract or ignore or deny each other, but to actually care for one another and celebrate one another and discover one another together through art. And I also happened to be earning my living as a teacher's aide, as a bilingual teacher's aide in a public middle school, and was seeing the role of art in photo classes that I would teach after school, in allowing and providing space for students to express things that sometimes were beyond language, or certainly beyond the given structure of the school day or the ways our bodies are conditioned. And so pretty early on, I was thinking a lot about how we can, on the one hand, intervene in and transform institutions, and also how so much of our work needs to happen well outside of and beyond institutions, particularly mutual aid and the way we care for one another. And somehow I'm still lucky enough, thanks, I think, to the support and care of a lot of people over the years, to still be doing versions of that. I didn't know at the time that that would end up being life's work. But maybe in hindsight, it seems like, oh yeah, I guess I was being pointed in that direction.
Thank you both. Yeah, and I think this question that you raised, Pato, in the kind of capital A art world, but also kind of the capital A art world's relationship to power, and at the same time, the sort of inverse of the power that can be found in creative practices and in art making, not just in sort of the the fulfillment of that personal relationship to creative practice, but what it can do in terms of a larger scale of power relations. Thank you for sort of raising that. I think, power is at the crux of a lot of what we are working against, power and oppression in our movements. I've been thinking, so I'll share with the audience, I'm so excited to have Ali and Pato here. We met for the first time on Zoom last week. I knew a bit about their practices, and also thankful to Visual Aids for recommending both of them. And part of what really drew me in thinking about this conversation is the sustained collaborative practice and relationship that the two of you have as practitioners, as creative practitioners. And, I think that collaboration is so important to everything that we do, into building movements and to supporting, I don't want to call them alternative art worlds, but art worlds that are based, not, right, as you said, Pato, not in extraction, not in about sort of a mutual aid and a caring for one another. And thinking about creative practices, I've been thinking a lot about imagination. And also, I think, right, that imagination is something that's a skill that I think artists really have an extraordinary kind of sense of. And with that, a way of world building and envisioning more liberatory futures. And, there's sort of all sorts of ways of looking at that and writing around, the potential of future building. But I think that artists have a particular ability to work that way, in the way that they're thinking in creative practices. And, relating to a few of the films that were screened as part of Day Without Art, imagination also comes up as a form of healing. And, in Dorothy Chung's video, Heart Murmurs, Dean, the focus of her film, he shares, quote, "My imagination can come up with so many cures for my body." And in Bo Gomez's work, This Bed I Made, Sean, one of the two men that the work focuses on, he uses his creativity to reconnect to his body and his identity. And my question for each of you is, how does imagination play into your organizing work? And how does it serve disability justice and other social justice building movements? And we have a slideshow with some works both by Ali and Pato. So I am going to share that. So as we get into some of these conversations, we have some visuals as well.
Thank you so much. When you were talking about imagination or collaboration, I was thinking about how, even dreaming is collaborative. Like you dream about your relationship to the world, about your relationship to your ancestors, about your relationship to the past. So even in dreaming, there's collaboration, there's conversation, there is intersection, and I feel like Pato and I, in our work and our collaboration, in talking about healing, I know for sure that I wouldn't have gotten through 2020 without the balm that is Pato, without the Zoom conversations, because at that point that was all that there was, that we were engaged in, and having deep and meaningful and hard conversations in the context of a pandemic emerging and an uprising. And so I'm always going to hold that time space as significant to the formation of our relationship, and my introduction to What Would an HIV Doula Do, which is a collective that we are a part of. And in terms of my own healing or my own imagination, I know that, when I began to write again, because it was a period of time after high school where I decided, going back to what Pato said earlier, this capital A art and the art world and art making, that I didn't have the tutelage necessary to name myself as a poet, or that I didn't have the education or the experience of a poet. And so I stopped writing for a while. And it was only when my mother was diagnosed with non-small cell lung cancer in 2007, in the summer of 2007, that I began to write again, because my mother, my Umi, was a huge fan of my writing, and in her, new reality and kind of my experience as a child of hers, trying to prepare myself for her death, right, which we knew was coming, because at the time it was stage 4 cancer, and the oncologist and everyone was saying, months to years at that point. And so waiting for this inevitability to happen meant that I started to mourn her before she was gone. I started to mourn our, my losing her and her transitioning. And then a year later, I tested positive in 2008. And so then I started writing about grieving her, and also dealing with this new reality. So these two realities emerging in our bodies. And I didn't tell her, and she didn't find out that I was POS until probably a month before she died, because my younger sister told her. And so just dealing with disclosure and all that brings up in the body, in the mind, in the spirit. And so really my reactivation in terms of like writing in poetic form was because of kind of grappling with death and mortality and disclosure and disease. And and grieving. And so one of the promises that I made to her, to myself, was that I would write a chapbook, that I would commit myself to forming these words about grieving and these words about loss. And there's something that I needed to produce. And so that's how A Flower Left to Wilt, which is my first poetic chapbook, came to be, because of those experiences, and deeply entangled with disability, disease, and loss.
Thank you for all that, Ali. You use the word balm, which I think a lot about in relationship to your work, and I think we'll maybe see later in the conversation your amazing reverence chair work and ceremony work that you do with others. But I also can't think about this question outside of death, because my father's father died of a really horrible colon cancer in his mid-40s due to the labor that he had done inside of the US's nuclear industry after World War II. That, of course, wasn't fully understood until decades later and was denied by the government. But that death, his death, happened in early December, and just 7 weeks before I was born. So I always say that death was my amniotic fluid, that my mother somehow in Southeast Idaho, where she did not have history or people, in the midst of this terrible grieving and loss that she and my father and his family were going through, brought new life in and holding this cycle. That life happened to be me, but it was this very early lesson, I think, before I was even breathing in shared air of the world, about relations, right? And about medicine, and about the limits of balm, depending on balm, BALM, the scale of metaphoric and other bombs that besiege us, and thinking about what it means to constantly live with that, and not only in fear, but also in care. And the amount of care and love that I received, because the new life that arrived amidst such sadness and sorrow was its own kind of balm and possibility, this sense of continuing to move forward, even when it feels impossible to make sense of what's happening or has just happened. And I couldn't have really articulated it that way early on, but there were versions of that were being articulated for me. And I'm slowing myself down because I like to talk really fast. And I realize our interpreters are doing really amazing work, which is part of a disability justice practice, right? So that we can speak in multiple forms and languages with one another. So I'm slowing myself down during these stories to remember what the practice looks like right here, right now. And Steve and Lizzie have been doing beautiful work to make this a shared conversation. And I think that's part of what disability justice asks us to do, is to slow down and remember, and not do the work of ableism, just like we should not be doing the work of racism or transphobia or class oppression. That's more easily said than done. And I think imagination for me is always central. And I'll give you an example. We're talking about important, heavy stuff, and I'm doing my best to not do this, but the sunshine and the clouds are having their own imaginative art dance out the window, right? They're doing movement work. And if I move in a certain way, as it continues to move, then they come in and we start to be. And of course, I'm breaking the fourth wall of the screen right now, right? I'm reminding myself and us that we're in a world outside of this Zoom verse. And I'm grateful for these relations. This mid-December sunshine feels really good to me. And it makes it a little difficult for me to have even lighting. And so I'm doing this in real time. I'm making this up because imagination in movement work for me is also about play, and it's about relations, and it's about medicine, and it's about irreverence and humor, especially when we're dealing with such difficult, overwhelming, and intense stuff. And I think folks in struggle, or folks just surviving, know the power of a kind of humor that can get us through. And it's not a humor that is at someone's expense, right? It's not a kind of cheap humor. It's a deep humor that heals us through a laughter or a touch or a caress or an act of care that comes from and goes right to the heart of what's at stake. And that's a lot of pressure on art, which is why I sort of did this, right? Like my little kind of interpretive dance with the sunshine, because that happens too. And I notice that when I'm in a kind of super intense and heated organizing session, or, strategy process that we can just get out of our bodies and out of the moment instead of remembering to be in relation to one another. And so there's a thing we might call art as if it's an object and it's outside that comes into the process, but it's also a way of being. And just if we can hold that in our movements, then we maybe have a chance to not try to enact change on the terms that have been forced upon us, but rather in the terms we might imagine. So when I found out Ali, that time we were walking in West Philly in the chilly winter light, that your earliest stories and poems were about fairies and magical beings, I was like, could you please stop all your quote activism now and do the other A word and just be an artist poet in the world? Because I want to be vicariously or maybe alongside that world of imagination that you were giving to yourself and others in your marble notebooks at age 6 or 8 or whatever it was. And I think we had this moment together of like, yeah, what how do we make this our movement? How do we make Fairy World our movement? Which I think disabled folks and Crips are all too adept at, right? Because we've already been made to feel othered, and so many of us can feel that way. And so we're already inhabiting a world that is different than the terms that are constantly being reinforced.
Yeah, that was such a beautiful day.
Hmm.
And thank you for coming to Philly. I know you had to be in Philly, but thank you for coming to Philly. So we had the opportunity to take a stroll. And it was a cold day, but it was again a sunny day, like today seems to be. And yeah, and I think a lot about rhythm and like you said, like this dance that you're doing with the sun. That's so important to being and to movement work. Um, and I definitely, that resonates with me when you talk about being in very tense organizing environments and you have a plan, right? You have this plan that has dots and language on paper about what action should be taken. But I think the rhythm, right, the aliveness doesn't, it's not on paper, right? It's in that in between space. And that's where the power is, in that rhythm. And I often, because I'm the person who loves to focus on chanting, because I think the power of rhythm and movement and like formation is like it adds something to actions. And so I'm often like curious every time I'm at an action about the pace of how people are moving their bodies, or what is it offering to people who may need a slower pace, right? Are we holding the folks who have to move in a slower pace? Are we sharing the chance with people before we're inviting them to do a call and response? And the rhythm of the possibility, or the unknown, right? Of what may happen when you get there, what may need to shift. And oftentimes, yeah, I find that rhythm is so very important to movement work.
Yeah, I agree. And I always love your enchantations. Like you just do something so special. And again, I think maybe when we see the images of the chairs, like that's a rhythm too, right? What does it mean to slow down enough to actually, to just do that? And especially in a Zoom verse, or the urgency of action or intervention, direct action in particular, this, I'm going so fast, sorry, interpreters, but the now, right? And that's why I accelerated as compared to slowing down. And we need that full range of rhythms, I think. But how we know to syncopate together, right? When some of us can't move fast, or it literally does harm to have too much shouting around. So one of my most frustrating symptoms of the dozens of long COVID is I can't navigate multiple sound streams at the same time. It does what I call a neuromelt. And I had this literally happen in my class yesterday, and I had to step out briefly. All it was one music soundtrack, and then the presenters talking about their beautiful project that they were making to bring people together. And I was trying to run the computer, and I just could not navigate just these 2 or 3 different inputs at once. And one of my sadnesses is that I can't really be at parties or marches anymore. I can't navigate that level of stimulation. And so that level of collective rhythm and joy and release and rage and confluence and intervention has to look different for me now. And I think that's part of what informed some of the ways we've been thinking about doulaing and the multiple roles that we play in uprisings, in movement work. And I'm certainly getting schooled all the time against my own ableism by folks who have been thinking about this and enacting different ways through disability justice for a long, long time, forever, really. And so I really appreciate your reminders about rhythm and the way you bring chant into the bodies that are making change in the work that you do. And I never feel like I have to come to Philly. I always am grateful I get to be in Philly. So we're overdue.
Yes.
Thank you both. I think since we have the images, I'm going to go ahead and share, but I think, and so much that you were, just sharing now around imagination and how that comes out, and both in thinking of care and moving in sort of impossible times of needing to move forward, and also the idea of deep humor, which I think is very connected to care. I think there's elements of sort of both of those things in some of the individual works that you both have done, and also the collective editorial work that you've done for the zine, What Would an Uprising Doula Do? So let me go ahead and share my screen, which this first image of yours, Pato, I think when you were talking about, I think that there's something that has so much that's deeply rooted in care, and also a sense of play in these spoons. And, I think, something we talked about last week is, this practice of care and the need for rest comes up in both of your work. And I think, this, and also, holding space for mutual aid and caring for others, while also having to sort of balance your own capacity and boundaries, which I think can be very challenging. I think even as we're talking in this, the Zoom of capacity, and thinking of how quickly I know I start to talk, especially if I get a little nervous, and what, and sort of that practice of slowing down, and I guess I'm thinking both around these works, and then also, how this expands out to justice work that we're doing, social justice work. But I thought, Pato, maybe you could talk a little bit about this series, Countermeasures.
Sure, and thank you for all that. And the son wants in on the game, so if somebody could send them the Zoom link and the code. Yeah, Senora Sol up there is saying hi. This series is called Countermeasures. And I'll try to talk about it in two ways. One is spoon theory, which some on the call may know about, but some may not. And so there's amazing thinker living with lupus. Her name's Christine Miserandino, who was out to lunch with a friend. And the friend said, sensitively, but also, unknowing, Christine, what's it like to live with lupus, this chronic illness? And Miserandino thought about it for a second and picks up a spoon and says, well, it's like you wake up, say, with 12 units of energy, 12 spoons, same size. And just getting out of bed takes one of your 12 spoons for the day. And then just getting to the bathroom takes a second. And maybe brushing your teeth or hair, if you have it, I don't, might take a third spoon. So before you've even thought about breakfast or getting dressed, you might have gone through 3 of your 12 spoons. And what it means to have to think about pacing, how to use the limited energy we have. And that's what this slide is. It's called pacing, and it's a spoon that, if you look carefully on the left there, the bowl can't actually really hold too much, especially if it was liquid. It would just run off and out. And this kind of roller coaster of rhythms of energy that a lot of us living with chronic illness and disability have to navigate every day, and to mind our pacing. Because once we're inside of a crash, it's very difficult to get out, and even rest itself isn't immediately restorative. And so spoon theory has been a really helpful, not just metaphor, but also practice and orientation to think about my spoons and to mind the spoons of everyone else and the community we make together through Disabled Mutual Aid and through Solidarity. And we become spoonies together, holding this question of our energy. So these are all made from eucalyptus. And once I could finally get out of bed from the acute phase of being infected really early in the pandemic in 2020, and could slowly begin to walk. For a lot of us, exercise itself creates a malaise and worsens our condition. But I needed to at least be outside with the air and the sun. And I was in Los Angeles when when the pandemic started. And so I was able eventually to make my way to a large park that is, I always call it, it's kind of like the Prospect Park of Los Angeles. And it's a lesion park. And that park saved my life. Like in so many ways, it connected me to something much bigger than myself, the bedrock, the cycles of the spring flowers, the hawks, the rabbits. I was really pulled out of my own humanness and thinking about the interspecies dance with the sun, but also with this ember that I swallowed and was setting my whole body aflame, which is the coronavirus. And there was a really big storm uncharacteristic of Los Angeles, and this giant eucalyptus tree that I had been saying hi to during all of my slow walks lost a limb. And the limb itself was almost as big as a tree. And eucalyptus trees aren't indigenous to California. They came vis-a-vis colonization. And so this tree is super big and beautiful, and relations had been adapting to it all around. But it was also a newish visitor, even as it was already decades old and giant and strong. So this limb fell, and I kind of studied and said hi to this limb for weeks on my walks, and then eventually asked if I could gather some of it. And out of that fallen limb and this kind of vestige of colonialism, but a beautiful being nonetheless, comes these spoons. So they're made of salvaged wood, and the labor and the small micro movements of just cutting and carving and sanding and listening was a really helpful pacing for me, tedious at times and challenging because I had never carved spoons, but my uncle Thomas Henscheid sort of taught me the ropes. He's an expert carver and a very great teacher. And then I got really hooked and then had to metaphorically mind my spoons as I was making these spoons. And so to me, it's an example of art that I suppose at its worst, it's just an illustration, right, of spoon theory. But the act of care in making and the set of relations with the tree and my uncle and with other spoonies and the kind of tenderness, but also the immediacy, like almost everybody's had an encounter with a spoon at some point in their life. And so I started thinking like, oh yeah, what if the way we kind of scale our frameworks for movement building could be as impactful as Miserandino's spoon theory has been, and how once you learn of spoon theory, you kind of never look at a spoon or think about your energy the same again. And that to me is the power of an idea or metaphor. And art and movements make our ideas and new worlds embodied, make them literally possible right here. So I'll pause there because that was a lot, Sarah.
Thank you. I think too, in thinking about the movement and the practice of making them, there's also this, meditation, but also care in the practice of creating these spoons. And this kind of full circle of this kind of ecosystem that you build from the practice of and care of making to the thinking, of not just how this is holding sort of your relationship to your spoons for the day, but also being held in community of spoonies. So I think it's really beautiful work, and in the kind of multiplicity of how it shows up. And thank you for that. And I wanted to share, Ali, we'll move to your work.
Yeah, I just want to reflect on Pato's art. It's so beautiful, like the texture and how you can tell that each spoon has its own personality. And then I was thinking too, when I had COVID, one of the first ways that I knew is to taste, right? I had gone in the fridge to taste. I had just made this huge amount of, I found some black garbanzo beans, some heirloom garbanzo beans somewhere. And I love to cook. And I love garlicky hummus. And I made this garlicky hummus. And so in the next day, you know, hummus is better to me is the second day. And I go and I take a spoon and I take a bit of hummus and I taste it, and I can't taste anything. And of course, I'm like, I put so much garlic in here, like I should be able to taste the garlic. And this is in April of 2021, and couldn't taste anything. And then I taste something. I try to smell things. Then I'm like, fuck. Excuse me if sorry for using that language, but I cursed. And so looking at these spoons is a reminder as well, right? It's like this idea of togetherness, but it's also a reminder of the symptoms, of some of the symptoms, at least, or like, you know, using the spoon to try to taste and can't. And that being the first moment that you realize that you have COVID. So yeah, thank you, Pato, for these beautiful spoons, and for the reminder too that COVID is here, and persists. These images, I love these images because these images were taken across the street from where my mother's mom, my maternal grandmother lived for many years in West Philadelphia. This is a part of Fairmount Park that's near 40th and Girard Avenue, and like close to Parkside Avenue. And these are images from the 5th cycle of Black Reverence Chair, which is a public ritual that I began receiving in 2016, right after the murder of the state murder of Philando Castile. And in Alton Sterling, I had been a part of this organizing group called the Black and Brown Workers Co-op. And there were a week of actions in Philadelphia after the murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. And I was witnessing so much consumption of Black death, right? Of digital representations of Black people dying. And I started thinking, what would it be like to bear witness to people living, to Black people living, to Black people living and affirming each other in public space, in the clearing of a field. And I started thinking about old photos from photo shoots where there's a wicker chair that's really ornate and has a huge back. And so the name came to me first. And so I was like, oh, Black Reverence Chair. And then I started just having conversations with people. Some of them were Yoruba practitioners, some of them, all of them really spiritual people, or musical people, about how this could be. And began to kind of come up with this design of a circle of people in the clearing of a field, surrounding this beautiful ornate chair that has all, you know, the drama and flowers, because I believe that flowers are very important as a symbol, but also as a kind of a decorative device as well. And, you know, there's a saying about giving people their flowers while they're alive. And so that's a part of it too. And the circle, they all enter the space and collective meditation. And then there's a prompt or a moment where the gatherer of affirmations tells people to think deeply what they need to hear while they're in the chair. And then folks are invited to write a phrase or a short poem or words on an affirmation card. And then that card is placed into a basket, and then each person rotates into the chair. And then there's someone in the middle of the circle reading the affirmation, and then the circle is responding to that affirmation. And said I did this 5 times, and each time I realized that it's life affirming to do this. And I was just recently asked to do a cycle for a Joy-a-thon that a Black bookstore in Philadelphia is doing this coming Saturday. They're doing 24 hours of joy. And so they're inviting different practitioners into this bookstore to kind of hold different events. And someone who had, actually the photographer who took these photos, who created the Museum of Black Joy, had been to 2 cycles of Black Reverence Chair, and participated, but mostly took photos. But everyone participates in this ritual, so no one is like, even the person who's the chanter, the person who gathers affirmations, then there's someone who keeps time. They all like rotate into the chair. So had experienced this twice and said that there's some kind of technology here, spiritual technology, that she felt like more people should experience, and she wants everyone to experience this thing. So hit me up last minute and was like, can you do this for this Joy-a-thon? Because you leave with this charge, this energetic charge, and that stays with you. And so, yeah, these are some pictures from that ritual. And at the end, there's a libation ceremony to complete the cycle. And I think about the cycles and I always talk about the previous cycles at the cycle, as the cycle is about to begin, because all of that energy, I wouldn't say captive energy, but that energy that has been growing and poured into from previous cycles, kind of they follow and they hold the new cycles. And so I always name where the first cycle happened, where the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and now the next one would be the 6th, and talk about the places that they happened in as well, because I think place is so important to ritual work. So to honor the place, that's why I said, this was directly across the street from where my grandmother lived for a long time, because this was in the summer, and we were supposed to do a citywide tour of Black Reverence Chair, and each person who was the chanter, who held that role, got to decide where they wanted it to be. And so for this cycle, I was the person chanting, and I decided I wanted to be near where my grandmother was. And unfortunately, because of the weather, the other cycles couldn't happen. So hopefully in the future. And the last thing about this is that this chair was actually designed for the purpose of this ritual. By an artist named Ajmal Millar, who's an amazing multidisciplinary artist who welds and uses found objects. And so there was some resource there to bring Ajmal to Philadelphia to design this chair. And then this cloth, this like fabulous looking purple on the back, is from my altar. So I took it from my altar. It drapes a small part of my altar where I put candles sometimes and water. And so that is from my altar. And at the top, you'll see there's a space for burning incense over the person's head. So yeah, that's a little bit about Black Reverence Chair.
Thank you, Ali. I love the idea of the spiritual technology and the holding of energy sort of as you move forward with each cycle. And I'm curious, can you share the bookshop that's doing the 24 Hours of Joy this coming weekend?
Absolutely, it's Harriet's bookstore it's in North Philly. It's owned by a Black woman named Janine Cook, and in collaboration with the Museum of Black Joy, is hosting this 20. It's very ambitious. It's 24 hours of programming. So yeah, I'm excited to experience it.
That's amazing. Are you participating in all 24 hours?
No, I'm trying to figure out where in the time that they have open. They pretty much booked up. So they have a few hours in the evening on Saturday. So I'm still thinking through logistically if I can make it happen, because it's so last minute. So I'm trying to make it happen.
And Pato, did you want to respond?
Well, I wanted to be respectful of your rhythm and time, Sarah, if there were other things you wanted to get to, but I find this ceremony so beautiful and so layered, and I'm glad that the photos can embody at least a moment of it, Ali, because the amount of, I don't know how to say it, it's like an 8 hands massage or something, but also on the inside there's just so much happening in the work. The thoughtfulness of the chair, the siding of where it's happening, especially this one that was, presencing your abuelita, your grandma, but also the way that it's full circle. And as you said, it's like we get our flowers here and now, we give them to each other. And I can't help but think about how the story you told about your mother's death and your own seroconversion, and then, being maybe inadvertently, but outed about your status, how all that you've navigated for me comes through in this part of your practice, right? Even though this wouldn't seem to be directly about HIV or directly about your mother's death, like the amount of care and that word you used earlier, balm, I think is so resonant. Yeah, I kind of just wish there was resources and support for you to do this at whatever pace worked for you. But I feel like we need and deserve this in so many of our communities. Yeah.
Thank you. So I learned about both of your work first through What Does an Uprising Doula Do? And this is a zine that you co-edited, and you're both part of the collective What Would an HIV Doula Do? And in the introduction to What Would an Uprising Doula Do? A doula is understood to be someone who holds space for others during times of transition. And I was wondering if you could expand a bit for the audience on this idea of a doula in the way that you see the role in this project, and thinking about how a doula can support social justice movements, as well as, I would say a bit about sort of the process of collaborating editorially, but the collaboration with the many contributors to the zine.
Ali, do you want to go? You want me to start?
Yeah, I would love for you to start.
Okay. So, as Ali alluded to earlier, we're part of a collective called What Would an HIV Doula Do? That was a process of asking that question together was initiated by the amazing organizer and artist and teacher Ted Kerr many years ago, almost a decade ago. And we had birth doulas and I think 1 or 2 death doulas in that group. and helping us learn from the process of what does it mean in the transition of bringing a new life in, or the way you were beginning to say goodbye to your mother, Ali, before she was even gone, holding us in these most intimate of transitions that we all make. All of us are born, all of us will die, but we don't always have rituals of reverence like your chair or in these really signature moments of our existence. And so those doulas were helping us think about this question of transition and what it means to sometimes mind the institution. Like, no, you're not going to kick the three cousins out, even if the limit in the room is 3. We want to have this many people here to say goodbye to our elder. Or when somebody's like, I'm actually really saturated and I know they need to see me, but could you just ask them to go outside for 10 minutes? Like, the level of care that centers, in this case, maybe an individual, a person who's going through transition, can move at many different levels. And so we just began to ask, if HIV is a series of transitions ongoing in someone's lives and our life collectively, what would a doula do? And Sarah, I don't know if you would indulge me to just read maybe 3 paragraphs as a way to answer the question. Is that okay? I think it will be brief.
Yes, please do.
And then we can maybe talk process of the zine that we're referencing and what you're looking at. We said we can, to the question of what can a doula do in an uprising, and we created this zine collectively in the first 6 months after George Floyd was murdered by the state in Minneapolis, as we all know. Doulas can also safeguard and shepherd seeds, helping to cultivate conditions for change. A doula minds demands and dangers, needs, and the nascent. A doula asks. A doula listens. A doula can be quiet. A doula can scream. Doulas can use our hands, networks, traditions, skills, phone chargers, stimulus checks, leftovers, voices. A doula can lose their voice, happily hoarse, with the recourse of call and response. A doula can sing, and a song can doula you through transitions. And then slightly less poetically and a little more literally, especially in the face of an uprising, we said, a doula can give water and masks, Zoom massages and knowing nods, harm-reducing, healing touch, delivered meals and transferred coin, a couch. A doula can be scared, sick, skeptical, believing, embarrassed, ecstatic, evolving, humble, humbled, joyful, spent, rejuvenated, determined, deliberate, irreverent, innovative, and interconnected. A doula recognizes and honors limits. A doula can offer reassurance and rest, replenishment and release. A doula dances with uncertainty, as you reminded us earlier, Ali, and admits to not knowing. A doula is a formulation, a formation, a praxis, an action, an opportunity to give and to grow. Solidarity and love are doulas. So that was some of how we were wrestling with your question 3 years ago, Sarah. Like, what is a doula? What might they do in the face of an uprising? And I'll toss to you, Ali, if you want to add and maybe talk about especially this beautiful image by Ariel and how the zine came together.
Absolutely. What you're seeing on the screen is a beautiful submission to the zine that Pato and I edited. There will be enough. And this submission was from an artist and dramaturge, Ariel Julia Brown. And you see a picture with birds in a tree, on tree branches. And the caption reads, "The trees above what should still be my family's land in Montezuma, Georgia. The trees are full of turkey vultures gathering resting, preparing for feasting, a collective grief doula, she induces recollection of memory and debts. She induces recollection of memory and debts. That really resonates with me. This idea of inducing recollection of memory and debts. Such a beautiful way to talk about reparative action, you know. And when we're talking about uprisings, we're talking about reparative action as well. And yeah, in 2020, we began, this was a series, I just want to say, of 3 zines. This was the last zine, Pato, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this was the last of 3 that we did in collaboration with One Institute, which is a beautiful organization that archives, is an LGBTQ archive, I believe, and on the West Coast. The other 2, there was a COVID zine, which was the first one. We did a zine about intimacy, which was In Our Beds. I think that's the I forget the title. I'm sorry, my mind. Sometimes
I think number 2 is In Our Bodies.
In Our Bodies.
And when you asked, I realized I think there was a 4th zine after this one about harm reduction, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we started off with, we were, again, a big point of process for HIV doulas is to question, right? To ask questions and to engage with questions. And so Pato and I kind of said, what would we ask in this context of an uprising? What questions could we ask? And then we came up with the list in terms of our editorial process of all these questions. And I think we landed on 5 questions, and each person was invited. We did some outreach to specific people, and then also to the doulas, to invite them to respond to whatever prompt moved them. So there were 5 prompts, and then JD, I saw that there was a submission from JD David's that was on the screen. I don't know if we can find that. But I just want to uplift that there was one question or prompt that JD surfaced for us, which, you know, in our process hadn't been a part of it, which was, what would a sick or disabled doula do? But there were 5 prompts in this, and these are submissions in response to them. Do we have JD's?
We do. So yeah, it's here, and then the next 3 spreads, I think, are, so sorry, I stepped in, Ali.
No, it's okay, please.
Just, yeah, JD was asking a question that's pulsing in the chat right now from a few of our people who are with us on the call. And as Process said, okay, so we've invited this, our collective is very amoebic and it has dozens of people. So we put out the call to everybody in the collective if anybody wanted to contribute to the zine. And then, as Ali said, reached out to many other people who weren't yet, excuse me, part of the collective. And JD embodied that process a step further and tapped into his very vast and incredibly active disability justice community, asking a question: what would a sick or disabled doula do? And what you are seeing here is a range of responses, some of whom came in anonymously, and some of whom said it was okay to cite them and to name them. And I know that's one of the questions in the chat. It's a beautiful question about, for any of us sick or disabled, what does it mean to name ourselves as such publicly? When do we make the choice to disclose or even make that part of our framing? And when do we want to keep that private or confidential? And we can speak to that in a minute. But so these are examples of that process and what it meant to take an invitation and make it even broader, and then embody a collective set of voices to this question. This one says, a sick and disabled doula looks back at me in the mirror, brace themselves against the sink. They cry. Summer Deagle. There's much more to that, of course. A disability doula gives and takes space to recognize all the shit the non-Crips don't need, all caps, to think about. We welcome discomfort from those who don't know what's up. That's Sully Carmona. Christie says, they carefully plan the route to the protest site, choosing the path with places to stop and rest. They pay attention to where there is a washroom open, if at all, and bring needed supplies and water and snacks. Often attending isn't possible, and they cheer from home.
Thank you, Pato, for reading.
Yeah, thank you, Pato. Thank you both for sharing about the zine and the collaboration. And I think, you know, on that note, we're at about 1:15. So I think it's a good time and a good transition to move to some of the audience questions. I'm going to stop sharing. And we'll start with, I'll read the question, and then Pato and Ali, you know, please take it away in terms of responding. So this first question: good afternoon, and thank you very much for your generosity of spirit in sharing your practices. I wanted to share that I'm a musician and educator of music who suffered sudden hearing loss and hypercusis during COVID. While this experience was disabling, it was without a doubt an awakening. But I do struggle with how to speak of this condition publicly, whether in classes that I take now as a graduate student, or sometimes when I'm teaching my private music lessons. It's hard for me to activate from my music and increasingly social justice practice without speaking about my disability. But this can feel weirdly performative. Not that I'm performing, but I've noticed that it can be interpreted as such, as if I'm looking for sympathy. But I view it as a trying to exist authentically and bringing awareness, and to be able to connect more meaningfully with others, as so many of us are having a hard time, you know? Wondering if you have any advice or experience with this. Thank you so much.
I'm sending you so much warmth, and thank you for sharing that question or that challenge or the struggle. I think a big part of your question or exploration is about disclosure. And for me, you know, it's definitely important to consider what context I disclose in. And so I always think about that. Is it there's space for the disclosure personally, if it's about HIV or about long COVID? Yeah, so I can just speak for myself. I often think about the context in which disclosure happens, and can this space hold that? Some of the tactics I've used is, for example, since I had COVID, and I've had COVID twice, my memory is bad. Like, I don't remember or recall things. I email people immediately after we've confirmed that I'm going to participate in something, asking for a calendar invite, because if it's not on my Google Calendar, I forget. So that's something I've done, is to like just say, hey, like, this is a need that I have. Can you create a calendar invite? Because and I sometimes will tell them why, like, this is why I'm asking for this. And then sometimes I'll just say, can you do this? This will make it easier for me to remember. Or if it's on my calendar, then it's easily it's not forgotten. So those are some of the tactics that I've used in that context. But I do think, yeah, it is because of the world we live in, disclosure around disability or disease is something that is is ever moving. And I'll hand it over to Pato.
I think that's all very wisely said. You know, I too mind the context and where I'm at in a given moment. And I think especially in group dynamics, and I'm bridging to the next question a little bit here. In the face of institutional ableism, it can be exhausting. You know, if you're, first day of class and you sit around and you have to be the one as a student to raise the question, right, about, hey, you can't get into this classroom except on stairs, or are we going to take breaks, and when might they be, and how do we approach pacing? That's, I think, so can be so difficult in an institutional setting, which is why we need each other. I see in your question that you do one-on-one lessons. And one of the ways I try to remind myself to slow down and not ignore my needs, I may not always disclose them, but not ignore them, is to just ask that question as I'm embarking on a new relationship. How do we feel about possible exposure during the winter? I'm comfortable masking, and in fact, I want to and need to because I'm immunocompromised. How do you approach that, right? And sometimes I don't have the bandwidth or the energy to do that, especially if it's a series of one-on-one engagements. And so sometimes, like you say, Ali, I'll just set that and say, if you'd like to meet in person, just so you know, here's my protocol. I mask, I have filtration, I'll leave the window open. But when possible, to take that up and to do that slow work together, which to me is the disability justice, because I realize that in my desire to moisturize and have my cocoa butter on, that scent, if I'm in close proximity, might be difficult for somebody, right? And what might seem like comfort and balm for me and care could actually be really dangerous for somebody in terms of triggering their chemical sensitivity. Or pacing, that what I think of as a rigorous lesson in photography or music or dance may need to be a little different in terms of its structure. And I don't want to speak too metaphorically. I want to try to stay grounded, which is I talked about cocoa butter. But whenever possible, I try to remember to ask others what their needs are. And I find that often for able-bodied folks who aren't even thinking about this, that in and of itself becomes a light bulb moment. But I was taught a long time ago in organizing that we should never be the only one in the room whenever possible, whatever that room is and whatever the only one is. When we are, it's usually a sign that we're not in a space of justice. And so whenever possible, and that's hard in a one-on-one dynamic, but whenever possible, I try to find who are my people here, even if in solidarity, right? And what do I need to do to be in solidarity with them? I'll pause, Sarah, because I know time is ticking.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question.
Mm.
I think, Pato, you started to get into this a little bit, and I think it's, this is talking. So as a disabled artist, I often find myself in spaces that are justice/equity oriented, but are lacking in disability equity. Specifically, I find it in the difference between accessibility for audiences/those consuming the art and accessibility for those making it. My coworkers in art don't mask, and our building isn't physically accessible, but we are doing equity-focused work, and the venue for audiences is accessible to an extent. How can care and attention be paid toward audiences, artists, and administrators in the art industry in terms of disability justice and accessibility? What is the path forward for the art world with COVID as an ever-looming, though often ignored or underplayed risk? How can an uprising doula help to create sustainable patterns and actions for institutions and individuals? And I would just say, I think this is a concern in many of our institutions, and certainly I think also in our educational institutions of K through 12 and also in higher ed.
And that was a really, really powerful question. And I guess the way that I can answer this is to share reflection on this writing fellowship quickly, because I know we are with short time. I was a part of this playwriting fellowship for PAS writers, called Write It Out, and Paz HIV positive. And we had a final share on the 2nd of December in New York City at the LGBT Center. And what I found very helpful was that throughout the process of rehearsal and right before the in-person event, there was clear communication with an accessibility liaison, I guess you can call it, who had been a previous participant in this project. And that person helped with asking, right, with what Pato said earlier, with asking or kind of surfacing the care needs or the accessibility needs of people in the cohort. And then being very clear about, if you want to be here for the in-person tech rehearsal, you had to come at this time to take COVID tests, you know, and that we would have COVID tests present for you, or you could take COVID tests before coming to the venue. But being very clear about, hey, we're still in the pandemic, right? I think oftentimes part of the challenge that I've seen is that there is this this way that people are trying to move past the pandemic as if it's not with us, in the same way that people are trying to move past other pandemics, right? I was just recently at a screening of A Day Without, of the films Everyone I Know Is Sick, and there was this conversation about the pastness of AIDS, right? And it's not in the past. It's in the present, and it's daily for people in the global South and in the US as well. And so there is this kind of this way that capitalism tries to quickly move us past the experiences of the present, the ongoing experience of the present. And I think being mindful of that and having infrastructure and resource go to considering the needs of the participants, considering the needs of the audience, and having a person that doulas, right, the space, the groups of people through this process of caring for each other.
Seeing me nodding and trying to multitask because I want to put two resources in the chat. One is Kevin Gotkin's Crypt News Substack, which I put, and that comes out every Monday and is really a great compendium. Kevin does a great service to the community, and you may already know about this, Corey, so apologies if so, but that helps me see how people are enacting our work and then what it takes to do so institutionally, but also more grassroots. And then I think Carmen Papalia's work around open access that he's been doing for quite some time is also helpful, in part because some of what he is enacting is in Canada, not only, but in part. And I think it can be really helpful with institutions in particular. And I'm sorry to sound like a little bureaucratic, but best practices, right? Which is just to say liberation framework. And in a movement context, we might use one kind of language that could actually usefully scare institutions. But we can also code switch as necessary and say to an institution, you know, thank you for being attentive to the needs of disabled folk. One thing that I think the leading edge is in museums or in performance houses or in whatever is seeing this. And wouldn't it be amazing if your X institution could do that, right? And that's a kind of peer pressure, which movements do. We do on each other all the time, right? For better and for worse. But it's a way of pointing people, and I'm sure you already know all that, Corey, because you're doing the work, but pointing out to something that already is in existence just immediately stops, I should say, the notion that, well, it can't be done, or how on earth would people do it? And so Kevin's work is a way that I try to stay abreast myself each week as I keep expanding my understanding. And Carmen's work is, because with museums in particular, and the relationship between performance and visual art is another person's practice who I look to. Corey, I worry maybe that wasn't nuts and bolts enough, like specific and tactical enough, but I'm happy to continue. I know we are at time and we want to hear from Ali.
Thank you both. There's two, I would say, slightly more practical questions that I'll sort of raise out there, and then perhaps they can be answered in the chat. The first, let me go back to the first question. So the first question, I'm from Ireland and have been looking for information about disability doulas, and I've just heard a reference to them. Would it be possible to hear more about this? So if either of you have references or thoughts on that to share. And the other question is asking about how to connect with the two of you for collaboration. So if there's a website or email that you're comfortable sharing in the chat for folks that are here. I know there's interest, there are potential collaborators in the audience wanting to connect.
I'll say I sent this to Paula as an answer when the question came up, but this article is a helpful place to start. It's not as much a how-to resource for disability doulas, but this you could then track back from this article. So I'm moving quickly because of time, but this article that 19th News did about disability doulas, and I'll just put, you can reach out to me. I'm going to put a joke because I'm going to turn this into a stand-up comedy chat, which is I'm going to put up my Hotmail address in the chat just because I like to keep that account to make people laugh because it's been around that long. So yeah, you can reach me there, and also on IG. Rumor has it I'm sometimes responsive to DMs at Volandito.
Yes, I put my email in the chat. I'm not on socials at this moment, but you can email me for now. That's probably the best way to reach me. And in terms of resources, strategies for high impact, I don't know the website, Pato. Let me see if I can.
Why don't you talk and then I'll find it.
Okay, it's a project that JD began, and it's in collaboration, I believe, with all different kinds of disability organizers. The conversation that Pato and I had about art and disability was because I was a fellow, the first fellow for this project. And that's a resource. And JD used to have, I think JD still has a website, Cranky Queer. I don't know how active that website is now, but it was definitely helpful in a resource around disability justice work, frameworks. So that would be another resource.
And I just dropped both those. So Strategies for High Impact, which is the organizing work that JD does, and JD is part of our collective, and I think really one of the great thinkers about where HIV meets long COVID meets disability justice, incredible intersectional work. And then the Cranky Queer Substack. So those would be some resources we offer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pato and Ali, so much for everything that you have shared today in this conversation. And thank you to all of the folks that are watching in the audience, and for the really incredible questions that have been raised. I'm going to reshare my screen so that we have the text as well for the poem that Ali is going to read, and then I will turn it over to them.
Hi, thank you all for having us today. This is a poem I wrote in 2021 in response to reviewing a small portion of the ACT UP oral history videos. And so some of the language I'm using is directly from participants in the oral history project for ACT UP. Act Up. And this poem is a sonnet, so it's organized in sonnet form if folks are poets out there. Act Up. In closets are men that died of AIDS still, dressed in all black, homage to omen. Cancers blistered, then burst. I am death's meal. Profound legacy must act up foaming. Protest the budget gutted by Big Red. Head of state was a trickle-down nut drip. Candied raindrops that shower me in bed make under pressure diamonds as we slip. Unbreakable, bold, and beautiful suns, you have made it home to conquer the worm. Romantic calls happened here on the run, a ribbon in sky we are placed in urn. You needed me because for you I will gather flowers, ornate ones, for the thrill.
Thank you so much, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to the ASL interpreters and for everyone at CUNY who organized this. And thank you, Pato, so much.
Yeah, thank you. I love being in space with you, and I love that our doulas are always with us. Our What Would an HIV Doula Do collective, and Sarah and team, thank you so much for bringing this space into being, and the larger series that you do at SLU. It's really so extraordinary and such an important service isn't really right the word, but contribution and world making that you do for the city and beyond. So thank you so much for the work.
Thank you to Pato and Ali again for joining us today, to our ASL interpreters, to the whole team at SLU who have made this program possible. This is our last program of the fall 2023 semester, so please do check back come early January for upcoming spring semester programming. And thank you for everyone who joined us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.